the speakers because I know I'd love to hear from all of them. With our first talk this morning is with a contingent from SUNY, or SUNY, ESF, which is the Environmental Science and Forestry Center, and they're based out of Syracuse. Lead is Dr. Emmanuel Carter, who's Associate Professor in the Department of Landscape Architecture for over 35 years. And he's also the Director of the Environmental Science and Forestry Center for UNESCO Biosphere Reserve Studies. Also joining him is Scott Shannon, who's also a professor at SUNY ESF, as well as Danielle Cronin, Assistant Professor, as well as Sarah Constantino, who's doing her Masters of Land Architect. She's a Masters of Land Architect candidate. And their talk today is Advancing the Twinning Agreement, Champlain-Adirondack Biosphere Network, and Frontenac Arch Biosphere Network Partnership, which we've been meeting with QUBS, so it's very exciting to hear this talk. I'm going to put that back up. It's disappeared. Oh, welcome.
So, good morning, everyone, and I'm Emmanuel Carter, and as indicated yesterday evening, and I'm going to begin this discussion with basically why we are here. We are one of the support universities for the Champlain-Adirondack Biosphere Reserve. We do that jointly with Paul Smith's College down near Saranac Lake, New York, and also the University of Vermont over in Burlington. And as most of you probably know, most biosphere reserves are supported by one or more universities. And in working with Champlain-Adirondack, we are also working with Frontenac Arch Biosphere Network, which has a twinning agreement with Champlain-Adirondack. And that twinning agreement involves two long-term ventures, and quite frankly, we are here to seek people who are interested in working with us in these two ventures, offering us data, information, and collaboration. And we're also here because we think that our arrangement in this twinning agreement is also directly related to the work of A2A. So the elements of the twinning agreement are as follows. One is the development of an atlas of climate and environmental change, not a book that freezes the information, but a digital platform that will evolve. And so the idea is to make something that, and this will be discussed momentarily, something that is universally accessible and can grow and metamorphose as might be necessary, and that will be open to for people, decision makers to use, for citizens to use, for educational purposes, perhaps for school districts to use, and so on. And then the second piece is a series of rural planning and design workshops based on a model that we developed back in the 1990s with the National Trust for Historic Preservation and the National Endowment for the Arts in the States, and used nationally from Maine to Hawaii. And the hope is that much of the information and the evolving work that comes through the Atlas of Climate and Environmental Change will find its way into the work of the ongoing workshops that will be open to the communities in Champlain-Adirondack and in Frontenac Arch. So basically we're here then to seek collaborators for the Atlas and collaborators for the workshop, and you'll hear more about the workshop from Dan Cronin. And I should say that we also have our climate intern with us, but she just got bad news in a phone call, and so she needs a moment to be elsewhere right now. So Dan's going to take over all of that discussion. Okay?
So basically what we're doing with this Atlas initiative is So basically what we're doing or attempting to do with this Atlas initiative is to align this with all of the objectives of Adirondacks or the A2A platform. So we're trying to basically come up with a platform, as Emmanuel said, a living atlas to collectively bring together a lot of data sources and then also project out what scenarios might look like in the future with plausibility platforms. My background is in geospatial modeling and also scenario modeling, so that's kind of what I've been asked to contribute to this effort. So basically what we have for the front page is it's right now almost live. It's set up as a data repository where we're bringing together everything from climate projections with CMIP 6 and a capability to update to CMIP 7 whenever that comes out. So CMIP essentially is an aggregated model from International Panel for Climate Change for projections for things like temperature, precipitation, hydrology, ag climate, evapotranspiration, forest cover, land cover kind of classes, all contributing to vulnerability analysis. So once we have that fully built out from collaborative efforts from all of you, if you'd like to submit your data to this platform, we can basically run through feasibility analysis to look for impacted areas. And this is kind of a concept in mapping called deep learning, or deep mapping. Excuse me, not deep learning, totally different thing. Deep mapping, where people have the capability to collaborate as a group, right? And we can almost record what those scenarios can look like with stakeholder feedback whenever it's live, or subject matter impact versus live. Basically what that does is it stacks maps together. And whenever we run through different kind of suitability models and add in climate change or impacts of climate change based off of RCP values or emissions pathways, we can start to measure impact of what that looks like in these vulnerable areas. So we can start to get geospatial, but also understand what the future might look like with these assumptions. Apologies for the pixelation on these, but kind of basically what these yellow areas are indicating is the worst case scenario with climate change in this particular region of areas that can be impacted. We're also thinking to have dashboards. We've drafted out a few of them to road test what that could look like, to pretty much provide policymakers with distinct understandings about how things can be solved with the assumptions of climate change for habitat purposes to help for policy mitigation decisions. So basically how we're trying to align that with A2A is to advance climate and environmental science, inform decision making, to communicate and also to educate, so students and participants alike can use this, so it can be an ongoing platform even for K through 12 workshops. And then also to foster rural resiliency, because at the heart of these units, rural areas tend to be forgotten about, basically. And then and expand these networks out to other platforms, for example, for other ecoregions and or other biosphere reserves in the future. To transition over to Professor Shannon here, nested inside of hierarchy theory, as you've all seen as ecologists, understanding what happens at the landscape scale is very important and crucial. But a lot of that starts it has to align with the assumptions of what happens at the site scale, what communities are saying about assumptions of what can change in the future. So with that, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Scott.
There we go. Great. So I'm going to introduce a little bit more about the Yorktown program, which I was a part of from its conception and beginning in 1991, where National Endowment for the Arts initiated that program as intending to build a counterpart to one that you may or may not be familiar with called the Mayor's Institute on City Design. And so they had an RFP that went out nationally, and a lot of different universities applied to try to develop this program with them. And we ended up joint venturing with the National Trust for Historic Preservation to put that together with a pilot project in the first 2-3 years of the 90s that ultimately then grew out into a nationwide program. And it was really focused on how can not just big cities consider the designs of their environment, and how communities rely on the designs of where they live to support their quality of life, that extends not just to the aesthetics, but a whole range of other attributes that are design-oriented and planning-oriented in the way that we live in and build our cities and towns. And so that resulted in the creation of a program called Your Town. It has morphed over the last 30 years. We administered that program for almost 20 years at SUNY and in collaboration with the National Trust for Historic Preservation. It's been moved to 2 different organizations over time with a new name now called the Citizens Institute on Rural Design. But the foundations of that program that we laid 30 years ago and that we'd like to bring to the workshops that we're going to be looking at for the Champlain-Adirondack and Frontenac Arch Biosphere Reserves, and focusing on how we can engage community members in an educational sense and in bringing awareness to how important design and planning is to maintaining quality of life and gaining greater understanding of how living in a biosphere reserve it's a really important part of why they probably have the quality of life that they have there. So, the approach that we've used is 3-day immersive workshops that are highly participatory. We really tried from the very beginning to get away from a bunch of experts at the front of a room as talking heads saying, this is how you do things. But to try to engage community members and really those who, in many cases, are decision makers. A lot of the work that I've done with community design in the past, you often end up talking to or preaching to the choir that you're working with staff members with city planning departments or town planning or county planning departments, and they kind of already get it. But the folks who actually make decisions in our communities tend to be lay people. They're mayors, they're planning board members, they're members of the zoning board of appeals, and many of them have a very limited understanding of how design and planning works, both from a policy perspective or from a nuts and bolts perspective. So we designed these workshops to engage those individuals and really brought them together to work in a team-oriented environment and in a way that they could express all kinds of ideas in ways that I don't think in raising the awareness of design and the importance of that in small communities, not just in big cities. So, Emmanuel, if you'd like to take it.
Okay, so these workshops are unique, as Scott is saying, in that it's not a series of people who are experts talking to people who are already committed and professionally involved. The idea was to bring together people from planning boards, environmental commissions, historic preservation organizations, and also there was an attempt to group the people who were in the audience. You know, as you, I think, well know, that you can have people that live in nearby locations who don't really actually know each other. And so we, would group our audiences so that at the end of the 3 days, people would go away knowing one another. They could call each other up, they could support one another, they could share ideas. They could do that kind of collaboration that was discussed in our opening talk this morning in the next room. So the content usually started off with kind of a bit of history of the region, and especially the rural history of the region, how the villages came about, the advance and or decline of agriculture, and so on. Is this? Okay. Okay. And then we would get to the discussion of contemporary issues, so that we, kind of knew that we were in the right room discussing the right things for this workshop this time. Okay. And then the most important part of the 3-day venture was the design workshop. And the design workshop is focused on developing placemaking skills. I think you all know that often when our policymakers are making decisions, they're thinking about the idea and the costs, and with that, where the money will come from. And often, for better or worse, a good idea dies somewhere in the money discussion. And too often, the money might not have been as much a problem if the physicality of the problem could be reframed. All right, and as an example, one of the exercises that we offer in the workshop is logging trucks having a problem making a difficult turn in the middle of a village. And the easiest thing to go to is, you know what, we'll just make a bypass. And we'll talk about that bypass in the terms of millions of dollars. You can talk about it instead in terms of thousands of dollars by rearranging where the stop line is in the lane that is turned into and how you arrange the traffic lights, okay? And so something that seemed an intractable problem or one that would only be solved with millions of dollars suddenly becomes something else and very doable. And so the way in which we focus on the placemaking skills is we ask those in attendance to actually respond to a series of problems with drawings, okay? And one of the hardest things for us to do in these workshops is to actually get the lay people to actually pick up markers and start to draw, all right? We had one person who was part of our team, Cheryl Doble, who always got her people to draw first. And Scott and I would be there cajoling and pushing and shoving and looking like we were browbeating the attendees, and Cheryl just had them in motion, okay? But, so that kind of, problem solving, a lot of people after the workshops, they find that, okay, this has been transformative. We now know how to really think differently about things like traffic problems, Main Street revitalization, environmental conservation in and around their villages, how to do extensions. Developers come in and want to do a new subdivision, and instead of offering them a piece of land separate from the existing village, you make it a natural extension of the existing texture, and so on. And then at the end of the workshop, the people have to actually hang it up and defend it, okay? And again, this is something that most of these folks have never had to really do, and it changes the way they do business after that. So if you think about the imperatives that you're working with regard to Algonquin to Adirondack and the kind of connectivity you want, you also want to connect this to the success of your villages and your towns, and bring people into the problem-solving situation with a different skill set than they might have as of this morning. And so we're hoping that some of you will be able to work with us in these upcoming workshops. We also finish this off by helping people understand where to get assistance, financial and technical assistance to do the things that they want to do. And then two last things. The workshops then are aimed at providing new perspectives, new approaches, new skills, and then building regional networks. And we have gone back after these workshops and discovered that people in the ensuing years have in fact been able to collaborate across municipal lines to get things done. So yes, I guess that's all we have to say about that. And, is the format then to move forward with questions from you guys? If so?
Thank you. I was really interested to hear more about this project. I know you're in the starting phases, but for the GIS, the layer sharing piece, what's the estimated timeline on when you think that might be public facing?
Do you want to come to that?
For the timeline when we can go live,
Yeah.
more than likely a year and a half from now, we can move it forward quicker, but I think it really depends on how we process all of the inputs that are coming in. So say, for example, if a lot of you want to respond to this survey up on the QR code, and you start to pull in and add in a lot of data sets. If we're looking at 20 additional data sets, the processing time might take a little bit longer than that year and a half. With the standard data sets that we're planning to use, about right at a year and a half. So if you'd all like to contribute to this collaborative effort, feel free to jump in and fill out this survey. And also, feel free to email us. Did that answer?
Yeah, it did, thank you.
Any other questions? Yes?
Have you got the Biosphere on, the Frontenac Arts Biosphere on board with you at this point?
Yes. In fact, interestingly, the twinning agreement was agreed to moments after Champlain-Adirondack's new incarnation was established. I think it was back in 2018. It was in the process of us coming back together as a biosphere that our friends at Gary Clark asked us in a meeting down in the Adirondacks. He said, do you have teams that do rural planning at SUNY ESF? And I said, yes, we do. And he said, we'd like to talk further about that. And that's the rationale for making the workshops part of the twinning agreement.
Sorry, I missed the very beginning, so you may mention that. But now, is there anyone here from the Frontenac Arch in this room? Oh, okay.
However, I haven't heard about this yet, but I'm working on a different project, but I see there's some ways that we can connect. So I'm going to connect with Gary and hopefully some of you.
I think our two climate interns have been talking to one another.
Okay.
That we need to advance that before we get as deeply into the workshop as we'd like to shortly. We'll be doing more this summer.
It's also, Queen's University is also implicated to some extent. I mean, we're still in the stages, I think, of working out logistics, but for part of the climate atlas, and I think we're also looking down the road at collaborative opportunities for specific research projects. I'm just looking at the map that was put up, and my head is racing forward towards, getting that data up and running scenarios by it in terms of things like what-if scenarios for climate change and implications on, for example, species at risk. So I think there's a lot of opportunities for the platforms that are being developed and academic institutions to fund studies for graduate students to answer some questions, or at the very least start tracking and monitoring changes that are occurring on the landscape and the implications it might have for things like species at risk or invasive species. So there's lots of opportunity for application of these.
And my interest was the Your Town, because I used to be on the board, and I was on the arts component of FAB as well. And I don't know anyone really involved with it. But I really feel that, since its inception from way back, when I was involved, and we used to call it the watershed initially, that people have heard a lot about, climate change and what they can do, but it's on deaf ears to people along the river that are looking very much at money and development, since tourism was booming before COVID. And I, as a artist, basically, I really see the message comes through when you can get to some of those other people, like through art installation projects that reflect some of these kinds. That was my interest, through identifying who's there, and to keep in touch with that.
And I think Gary Clark has been front and center on the Yorktown side, he's got some expertise and definite interest in the road
And
development.
he comes from a perfect town that developed incredibly with the arts, so.
And I think we're also going to be having some collaboration with the Department of Geography and Planning at Queens, and I see Ryan Danby in the back there, who's, we hope will be part of that.
Thanks, yeah.
One last question.
Yeah, sure.
Asking people to commit to 3 days of a workshop is asking a lot. How have you found that you can get them to attend?
If I have this correct, we funded it. So we handled hotel and meals, and so that people could come and settle in for 3 days. And one of the reasons that it's 3 days is not only because because there's information exchanged. You need the people to get to know one another, and the design teams are set up so that it crosses the municipal boundaries that usually keep people from talking to one another. And so, in fact, actually, that ability of people in a region to know each other and to collaborate turned out to be even more important than whether or not they ever wanted to draw anything again, ever. Okay, and so the three days, it is important. They bond. That's the bottom line. But we had an arrangement with the National Endowment for the Arts and the National Trust for Historic Preservation to help us with that kind of funding. And this summer, again, once we get the new incarnation of the workshop kind of down on paper, our intention is to then go out for that kind of funding again.
Did I hear you correctly that you would pay for hotel rooms for them to stay?
Yes.
Yeah. And one of the things we found really early on, we tried to do this as we'll make it free for you to come. We're not going to charge you for the workshop itself, but you'd have to pay for hotels and meals and how to get there and that sort of thing. And that simply fell flat on its face. So the National Endowment for the Arts decided it was perfectly appropriate for it to be, if we want to see this happen, we needed to be able to provide the funding that would facilitate having people, these are lay people that are living in small towns. Many of them are private citizens who are not being paid by the government. They have their own jobs, they have their own companies, they may be farmers, you never know. And taking 3 days off of work is one thing, but having to pick up the cost of hotel room and meals and everything else that goes along with it simply proved to be too much to ask. So that was essential to getting it to work.
Well, I just want to worry of the timing here for our next following two speakers, so we have lots of opportunity to ask some follow-up
Yeah,
questions.
we'll be around all day.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all for joining me today, and thank you for the lovely introduction. My name is Grace, and I will be discussing the results of a gap analysis that I performed in the A2A region as part of my undergraduate thesis, as mentioned. So first of all, what exactly do the terms gap analysis and representativeness mean, and why are these concepts important? So gap analysis is simply a technique used to identify gaps in something. In this case, gaps in ecosystem types within protected areas in the Algonquin-Adirondacks region. Representativeness, in the same vein, looks at whether protected areas adequately represent the total area that they reside within. So this is important as it accounts for the diversity of landscapes within a region. So if ecosystem types are well represented in protected areas, it means that they are better protecting the ecosystem and biodiversity of the overall region. So this technique was performed in the A2A region to identify potential gaps in protection. So to actually perform this gap analysis, several steps needed to first be taken. The first was to develop a cohesive map of protected areas in the region. The second was to develop a cohesive ecosystem map of the region. And the third was to analyze how represented each ecosystem type is within the existing protected area network under present-day conditions. So, first a boundary had to be created around the A2A region. This is because, as I'm sure many of you know, there is no well-established specific boundary of the region, so it was opted to create one within GIS software. As you can see, the boundary includes Algonquin and Adirondack parks at each of the ends, and also the entire corridor in between, so it adequately represents the total area with some room to spare. All of the data that was created and used for this project was prepared and analyzed within this boundary in GIS software. So, first of all, after this boundary was created, a protected areas map needed to be created of the region. This protected areas layer needed to be created as there is no sufficiently detailed transboundary data for protected areas in the region. There is transboundary data of protected areas, however, it does not cover the full range of management types for protected areas within the region. So data instead was taken from both sides of the border, the American and Canadian sides, and merged using GIS software. So once this was merged, this showed a very detailed map of protected areas within this region, and detailed enough for the purposes of this analysis. However, once IUCN categories were considered as they were included with this data, it was opted to only use categories 1A through 3, as opposed to categories 1A through 6. And this is because of the different management types related to these IUCN levels. This is very much a simplification of protected areas in this region. However, for the scope of this analysis, as it is only an undergraduate thesis project, it was opted to simplify it by using categories that allow no resource extraction at all. So 1A through 3. And this was the final output of the protected areas data shown in a map. You may notice that the boundaries for Algonquin and Adirondack parks are different from the previously shown boundary map. This is because of the management categories previously just discussed. There are certain areas, for example, in Algonquin Park that allow logging, so they may belong to the lower level IUCN categories. So that is why they are not included on this final output. So this map also shows all of the different protected areas included in the analysis, color-coded by their IUCN category. So the percent of area that protected areas take up in the A2A region was also graphed by IUCN category. You may notice that level 1A and 3 do not actually appear on this graph. This is because they each made up less than 1% of the entire A2A region. And as you can see, 1B makes up 7.3% and 2 makes up 4.8% of the total region. So together, IUCN classes protected areas 1A through 3 make up around 12% of the total region. So next, an ecosystem type map had to be created. It was decided to combine land cover and elevation data. The land cover data is great, it was transboundary, already merged. However, after removing classes to do with human activities such as urban areas and cropland, only 8 classes remained, which was not detailed enough to show the diversity of ecosystem types within this region. So it was decided that this would be supplemented with elevation data, as this can impact land cover based on elevation. So this was done by taking a digital elevation model and then creating classes based on slope derived from this model. So Then, once this was created, there were 6 classes ranging from valley to ridge, and this was ultimately combined with the land cover type map to create a final output showing 48 ecosystem type classes, which will be used for the final analysis. It is not important to know or see all of the ecosystem. There's 48, so it's kind of difficult to read them all. However, just to know that it is very detailed and accurately represents the diversity within the region. So finally, a gap analysis was able to be performed. First of all, the ecosystem type layer that was created, that was just shown, was clipped within ArcGIS Pro software to the protected areas layer. The tables within ArcGIS Pro for both showing ecosystem type for both the total area and its respective protected areas were then imported into Excel. 5 sheets were created in total, 1 for the total Algonquin to Adirondacks region, and 4 for each of the ecoregions that subdivide this area. There are technically 5 ecoregions. There's a tiny gray one right at the bottom. However, this contained no protected areas within the classes that were used for this analysis, and represented just such a small area of the total region that it was ultimately excluded from the analysis. So once these sheets were created, the pixel counts for the ecosystem type layer were converted into kilometers squared for ease of analysis for the total areas along with the respective protected areas. These were then further converted into percentages of the total area to facilitate comparison between the total areas and their respective protected areas. And this was visualized using graphs such as these. So these show the results for the land cover and the elevation separately. The green bars on each of the graphs represent protected areas, while the gray bars represent the total Algonquin to Adirondacks region. There were similar graphs created for each of the ecoregions, however, for the sake of time, I will just be discussing the total area. For the land cover graph, you may notice that coniferous forests and deciduous forests specifically are overrepresented, meaning that the green bar is higher than the gray bar. So the percentages of coniferous and deciduous forests in protected areas is higher than the total area. In terms of elevation, flat slope is quite underrepresented as the total area percentage is higher than the protected area. Actually, around 15% less flat slope areas in protected areas versus in the total area. The middle slope is also slightly underrepresented, and the rest are in some way overrepresented. So putting both the land cover and the elevation data together, as in the ecosystem types, it shows it was important, as you may notice, that the deciduous forests on flat slope, represented by the gray bars on each graph, it's actually showing that deciduous forest on flat slope is underrepresented, whereas if you just look at land cover and elevation separately, it shows deciduous forest as overrepresented without looking at its elevation class. So it tends towards underrepresentation in flat areas, especially with regards to mixed and deciduous forests. And on the other hand, tends towards overrepresentation in lower and higher slope types, namely valley, lower slope, upper slope, and ridge types, especially in regards to coniferous and deciduous forests at these elevations. And note that the high percentage of water on flat slope in the total area, so the very high gray bar, is due to Lake Ontario being included in the analysis. So you may be wondering, what exactly do these results mean? Over and underrepresentation can be due to the favoring of dramatic landscapes, and also due to certain areas being less likely to be urbanized or used for agriculture or saved for those purposes. So for example, this is why, or potentially why, coniferous forests on ridge tops are overrepresented, as these are dramatic landscapes, aesthetically appealing to humans. Not saying that recreational, cultural values are not important in these areas, however, due to the scope, just considering biodiversity in this analysis. This is also why flatter areas may tend towards underrepresentation, as these are more likely to be safe for the purposes and used for the purposes of agriculture, for example, as opposed to ridgetops. So as you may remember from the pie chart that I showed earlier, only 12% of the total area is actually protected. Again, note from classes 1A to 3, not including classes 4 to 6. So compared to the goals for the future, such as 30% by 2030, this suggests that more protected areas may be needed, and within new protected areas, the results show that it would be useful to include more underrepresented ecosystem types, such as deciduous forests on flat slope, as opposed to potentially coniferous forests on ridgetops. In terms of next steps for this, I would say only a half-year-long project. One of the most important that I wish I could have done, however, we ended up not having enough time, was to add climate data into this analysis. As I'm sure many of you know, the distribution of ecosystem types can change due to climatic conditions changing. So it would be important to determine whether the current protected areas network outlined would hold up under these future climatic conditions. Thank you.
So, good morning everybody, and thank you for coming today. So I also helped organize the symposium, which makes me really happy to have you all here. And it's so nice to hear about the other projects that are going on in the region. I wish I could be in both rooms at once. But we're lucky this year to have a camera crew recording our presentation, so whichever ones you're missing, you can check out later on our website. So I do want to say that this presentation that I'm going to share with you is pretty similar to, less similar to Grace's, because we haven't started the analyses yet, and more similar to, is your acronym CABN, FABN? I love that. Okay, I was hoping that was it. So it's more similar to CABN, FABN, in the sense that we're in the initial stages of this. And we wanted to share it with all of you so that you know, for the same reason, so that people know what A2A is embarking on as we work on this project, and so that we can also look for collaborators. And just in the last two presentations, I definitely see a lot of questions I have that could support our work and your work as well. So you already know what the A2A is, presumably, because you're here today. But I do want to say that, similar to what Grace put up, mapping and defining the region was always a goal of the Algonquin to Adirondack Collaborative, and this was an early on map, and this is the one you can find on our website. And it's the same dotted line. It's like, oh, where is the A2A exactly? We occasionally get these emails from people asking, do you have a layer? Do you have a GIS file, a shape file we can download that's the border? And we say no, which feels like a ridiculous answer. But we don't have one. So this big circle is the same as what Grace and Ryan used, because we don't have an existing boundary layer. So this has always been a goal of ours, but we're a small organization and we haven't always had the capacity we need to pull these projects off. There have been, before I joined the board of A2A, which was in 2018, I think, there were several mapping projects that were done by with previous collaborations at A2A. So if you look on our website under our work, mapping, you can see all about these projects and you can download all the files that are created there. They are shared. But this project was in 2010, and it was a multi-partner project in Leeds and Grenville County, and then some portions of Frontenac County and Lanark. But you can see, whether you're from the US or Canadian side, here's the St. Lawrence River, right? So it was restricted to the Canadian side for funding reasons and capacity reasons. And this project was designed to do some mapping in the region, figure out where the connectivity areas were, identify places that had different levels of land ownership. All those files are on our website. And then this project later in 2014 built on that Sustaining What We Value mapping project and used some of those layers and updated some layers and did this regional connectivity mapping project. And this, I understand, was through A2A collaborating with the Ontario Natural Heritage Information System Center, which I think is through Ministry of Natural Resources. Yes, I'm getting a thumbs up for Ryan, okay. It's hard to manage the names of both the organizations on the US and Canadian side. So this project was a really great project. They did also work on the US side. You can see going up to the boundaries of Adirondack Park, not all the way up to Algonquin, and the reason was that those areas were fairly well, they had a lot of forest land coverage, so they decided not to do that region and to restrict it to this region. But where is that boundary coming from? That boundary was pre-selected based on, I forget the unit name, but like conservation areas. So not an internally generated boundary based on the data, but a priori boundary. So that's our mapping history, and now I'm going to tell you a little bit about the work that we're planning to do now on both the US and Canadian side for mapping, and then on the US side for some road ecology work as well. So I am, as Sonia said, I live on the US side of the A2A, and although A2A has always made a great effort to have board members from both sides, we weren't incorporated as a nonprofit on the US side until 2021. So that means we couldn't really write grants and get money. And you need money to do all these projects, as you all mentioned. So in 2021, so this is like what we did during COVID. We couldn't do anything, right? We just had Zoom meetings and talked about doing projects in the future. And so we actually managed to put together the paperwork to get 501c3 status, which is a tax exempt status on the US side, and then we were able to write grants. And the first grant that we got was a really wonderful grant through the National Park Service, the National Park Service River Trails and Conservation Assistance Grant. And now what this grant is it's not money, it is money in a way, but it's assistance from National Park Service staff who work in this program and come on board and kind of help small organizations with capacity by working with you themselves. So I didn't write this grant, our program coordinator Jenny Moe wrote it, and when she said we got it, I was like, what? This is no money. Where's the money? We need some money. And as it turns out, this is so much more valuable than money, really, because our two colleagues, Julie Isbell and Lelia Mellon, who were able to come on and work with us because of this grant, have been a huge help in planning this project. And so they helped us kick off, they helped us with capacity to then say, okay, well, what are we gonna do on the US side to catch up to all the great mapping work that's been done on the Canadian side and potentially catch up with the road ecology. We had a host of other projects, but in summer 2022, they helped us organize to have a workshop, a one-day workshop, just one day. But it was in the Minneanthony Nature Center, this beautiful place on Wellesley Island, and many of us camped there that night. And so we were able to do the bonding piece to bring people together, which does really help. And then we had US side partners saying, okay, now we can actually, raise funds to do projects on this side. What kinds of things would you like to see? And the projects that were prioritized were mapping and road ecology. So we decided, okay, let's move to the next phase of this, and let's really dig in and start doing a mapping and road ecology project on the US side. So this is our project team that's been working a lot on this. I really am giving this talk to represent this team. I'm not just saying that modestly. Bill Brown is definitely in charge of most of the mapping work and has been doing an excellent job with it. So I'm going to tell you a little about all the work we're doing. So that's me over there. That's the summer. We like to try and get out at least once in the summer and do a fun trip in the A2A. We're just exploring some new areas. So that's myself, John Davis, Alex French, who couldn't be here today, who's just moved to a job with Climate Action Reserve, Bill Brown, and oh, sorry, John, I didn't put John's name in the middle there, but he's not here, so it's okay. In the other room, don't tell him. So, and then we have Nasha Chowdhury, our executive director, who couldn't be with us today, but has been doing a great job for the past year working with our organization, and Jenny Moe, who does a lot of grant writing as well and has been helping with this project. And then Julie Isbell and Lelia Mellon. Lelia is here today, but she's feeling sick, so hopefully she'll feel better later this afternoon, and you can all get to meet her. So that's our team. So our project that we came up with, I'm just going to tell you quickly the goals of that project that we already started the mapping part of. So this first goal has started a bit. So basically, as I mentioned, we've never had the capacity to map that in a kind of organic way, where the data, the land cover data itself and the layers themselves are telling you where should we establish the boundary of this. And so the first step to this, of course, is to develop a GIS database of updated available data layers. So the last time we did this in A2A, it was 2010, so the layers were from 2008 or 9. So these are updated layers, and this is where I see, a lot of great opportunities for collaboration with you all. And so we're collecting all that data into the same place, and then our plan is to use a tool called Linkage Mapper, which, since we haven't done this yet, I'm showing you some examples from this report from the Mohawk watershed. This was done with support from the Nature Conservancy. This is basically the project we want to do for A2A, so I'm showing you some example maps from this area. So in this map, what you can see is that they had the same issue. They want to increase connectivity in the Catskills to Adirondacks. They didn't have an inherent boundary, so they used this tool, Linkage Mapper, to evaluate the corridors and linkages and figure out, okay, exactly where should we place this boundary? Because you have to focus your resources somewhere, right? So that's something similar to what we hope to do for that first goal. So then for the second goal, improve planning and build partnerships on the US side. That doesn't sound like a mapping goal, but it is a mapping goal, because we need to figure out which places will be the focus for conservation, right? We can't conserve the whole area. There's many people living here, there's agriculture, there's other land uses. What should be the priorities? So for this, similar to the Mohawk report, we're going to use CircuitScape. And who's used CircuitScape? Who's familiar with CircuitScape? Okay, of course you are. Yeah, I thought quite a few people would be, just because ecologists use this a lot, landscape ecologists. It envisions a landscape like an electric circuit board, where you run through a circuit and it goes faster, you could say, and it has high connectivity in areas where there's a lot of native habitat, and then more resistance to the current in areas where there's low amounts of habitat. So essentially, it's used frequently to put in a land cover and then analyze, okay, where's the places that wildlife can really pass through. Now, it's parameterized by experts, so experts have to say, this is good for wildlife, this isn't good for wildlife. So that's a weakness that's sometimes pointed out, but I mean, a weakness can always be pointed out. It's a useful tool. All models are good. No models are perfect, but some are useful, right? So the resistance can be general, which we plan to do, and then also can be parameterized for different species if we get to that level. So some species that a lot of folks here, especially and our board member John Davis and other people from the Wildlands Network, are interested in, is wolf, connectivity for wolves. This is an Algonquin wolf, to come back to the Adirondacks, and fisher and other animals that we might be able to look at specifically what they need to cross through the region. So that's the second goal, and this is just an example of, again, from the Mohawk report, showing you what that looks like. So when you first do it, it's pretty patchy in the sense, over here, that it's pretty pixelated, like it's very small scale. So if you're trying to plan on these large scales, like Don Carr is talking about in the morning, we need to look out at these large scales. We also have to look at the small scale, but it's easier to plan if you can see each small piece relative. What you can do is combine this CircuitScape data, where you have low flow areas or high resistance areas, and high flow areas or low resistance areas, and combine that with other data. So like land ownership data, existing land protection data, and smooth it out, like pixel X in relation to its neighbors, how much resistance is there, how much connectivity is there. And then you can come up with these priority areas. So you can see this map here, they've identified that so they have the concentrated flow is where there's high flow and narrow pathways. So you want to pick these areas for conservation, right? So they go from this whole region down to some areas where you can really focus your resources based on a fair amount of data. So this is what we hope to do with our project. So most of this is mapping, right? And this will be on the US side and the Canadian side for the mapping piece, for most of it. But then one piece that we want to catch up to the Canadian side with is the road ecology work, because there's been some excellent road ecology work done on the Canadian side by Cameron Smith, who's here, and Ryan Danby and other colleagues. And that study, which this map is adapted from a paper that was published in 2014, they collected data on this, which is the Thousand Islands Parkway, is that right? On this road for, I think, had 209 bicycle surveys over the course of several years, documented all the roadkill, and found that there were over 16,700 vertebrates killed. And actually, just to link into what Gary was saying this morning with the introduction, they were mostly amphibians. So let's say, so now that project is in the phase of being wrapped up, finished, final reports, and then moving on to try and actually mitigate some things, right? Actually build some infrastructure so that wildlife can pass more easily. So, okay, but then it's kind of disappointing if you're able to get through there, you get through the Thousand Islands, then you get hit by a car when you get to the US. So we want to catch up. We want to catch up and make sure that when you get to the US, the animals can also cross the road. So we are going to be doing a road ecology study, we hope, pending funding that we've applied to and should hear back on soon. This coming summer, that's some sites that we scoped out some of the sites last summer during our workshops, and our plan is to conduct the roadkill surveys during May to August, maybe in September if we're able, and then assess the transportation infrastructure for connectivity using the North Atlantic Aquatic Connectivity Protocol, which is commonly used in the US. It's used by the Department of Transportation, so we're hoping that our data can be useful for them as well. So speaking of that, one of the important things we're doing in this project is we all agree that it's important to start from the very beginning, not to do the project and then go bring our results to an agency, but to really work with the agencies from the beginning and say, hey, we're doing this project, what are the DOT, the Department of Transportation's interests and needs and limits? And so we've been doing that. That's been most of our work this spring. We had a round table with the Department of Transportation and some professors from Clarkson who are going to work with us. This man right down here, Eric Backus, he runs a company where students do summer jobs, and we're hoping to hire them to actually do most of the transportation infrastructure. And then we're having some people from, I think it's TNC, who are the NAC certified trainers, who are coming in to do a training for us. So it's all about collaboration right from the very beginning. Like, that's what A2A is about, right? And so we're trying to bring everyone in from the beginning so that in the end the results can be more useful. So all of that hopefully will be happening this summer, and ideally continuing next summer. Then we have this third goal, which is to identify and map community co-benefits from conservation within A2A. So, like many of the talks have said today, it's not just about nature, it's about people. And what makes a person who isn't a conservation person care about nature and care about actually protecting nature? And sometimes that's ecosystem services, right? And if you're familiar with that term, or if you're not familiar with that term, it means, okay, I don't really care about mangroves, except, oh no, my house is gonna flood, so actually I do care about those. So it's kind of, that's my cynical side coming across. So the community co-benefits, I think, are a good sell to people for why they should care about protecting connectivity. It yields direct benefits to them. And then for the cohort of people who love nature and want to see this connectivity anyway, those are still really nice to see. Okay, so then the last piece, as always, just in line with our mission in the A2A collaborative, is to share mapping products and tools to support partners and communities. So, as I mentioned in the beginning, our previous mapping products are available on our website, and these will also be available in that way. So the updated layers and products, and it'll be interesting to talk to CABN and FABN about how our databases could support each other. Ours will certainly be much smaller. It's not for that whole region. And so here's our project timeline. I think I partially wrote this to remind myself that we have to do this. We've started, but this will be a big year for us. So hopefully, I look forward to being able to present some results to you all the next time we do this meeting. And I just want to really thank again all the partners on this project, our team at A2A, and then National Park Service, who I do see Lilia is here. So thank you to National Park Service for all your support and help, and the funding support of the mapping piece, and then all our other partners who have been working with us so far. So, thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much, John, and thanks for having me to A2A. This is a real team effort. The Canadian Road Ecology Group, that's chaired by Cameron Smith. Cameron's at the back of the room. Cameron is certainly our spark plug. Make sure that we're on task and on schedule. What I want to talk about today is some data analysis and modeling that I've done with a couple of students in my lab, Joshua Jones and Evelyn Guerra, who've now gone on to greener pastures. Ori Urquhart, Ori's somewhere, maybe he's in the other session. And Ewan Eberhardt, who is actually with Environment Canada now, but was one of the instigators of road ecology science in the Frontenac Arch region. I'd like to start off A2A talks with this satellite image. This is a light pollution image. So red areas are areas of high light pollution or nighttime light emissions. Black areas are effectively no nighttime light emissions, and you'll see the Algonquin Highlands to the north and the Adirondack Mountains to the south, and this area in between that we call the Frontenac Arch. This really illustrates the low development, low human footprint on the A2A corridor, and in particular the importance of this linking function of the Frontenac Arch, this isthmus, if you will, between those two core protected bookends. The Frontenac Arch on the Canadian side is bisected by three major roadways along the St. Lawrence River. Many of you probably took Highway 401, Canada's busiest highway, to get here, if you're not coming from within Kingston. A major 4-lane expressway, and it is flanked by the Thousand Islands Parkway here, right along the St. Lawrence River, and County Road 2, which we used to call Highway 2, and I'll apologize, I often slip into old habits and say Highway 2 when I should be saying County Road 2. It's these two roadways in red that I'm going to talk about mostly today, but context for this and a lot of A2A's work on road ecology right now is instigated, if you will, by the impacts of Highway 401. So it's kind of front and center in our minds as we talk about road ecology on the Canadian side. On the Frontenac Arch, there are a number of different amphibian and reptile species that are considered to be species at risk. Well known amongst these are the gray rat snake, which is threatened, Blanding's turtle, also threatened species, snapping turtle and the eastern ribbon snake, five-lined skink as well, although as I'll mention later on, we didn't find those in any of our road ecology studies yet, and a number of frog and salamander species as well. Just a bit of a context or a history here. For the last 20 years, A2A has been conducting road ecology studies on the Frontenac Arch on these three highways that I mentioned. The top part of this graphic illustrates roadkill surveys that I'll illustrate, or I'll use data for in my presentation today, but also some mitigation studies looking at the role and the possibility of fencing and eco-passages for allowing wildlife to cross highways without getting hit. As I say, dating back to 2004, an early study by Don Ross from the Frontenac Arch Biosphere in collaboration with A2A, up to a very recent study where we looked at the efficacy of fencing along Highway 401, and the results of that are just being written up right now for publication. I'm going to draw for the rest of this presentation on data that was collected from the Thousand Islands Parkway study, ranging from 2008 to 2011, and then a follow-up study on County Road 2. That was, data was collected in 2016 and 2017, but then some additional data was collected during COVID, during 2020. This is Lynn Guerra. Lynn was a master's student in my lab. She rode the Thousand Islands Parkway to conduct roadkill surveys. Her and Ewan Eberhardt, who I mentioned earlier, collectively rode distance to Edmonton and back, over 8,000 kilometers to do these surveys. 37-kilometer roadway, 2 lanes along the St. Lawrence River. As Kate Cleary mentioned earlier this morning, this was 209 surveys by bicycle, and over 13,000 animals were found during those 4 years of surveys. 88% were amphibians and reptiles. They are really susceptible to roadkill for a variety of reasons that I can discuss with you in questions or during break. The follow-up study to this on County Road 2 was conducted primarily by Joshua Jones, Senior. Josh did much the same method, but at times he had to use a car. So we split his surveys between bicycle and by car, just driving very slowly along the shoulder of the road. He found over 9,000 animals, and again, a very high proportion of those being reptiles and amphibians. So the objectives of this particular study were to use this collective data set, which, as far as I know, is the most extensive in Ontario, as far as surveys and the sheer volume of roadkill that have been documented. First, we wanted to identify areas of high roadkill mortality, just these what we call hotspots, clusters, if you will, areas along these highways where a lot of animals are being killed. And then second, we wanted to use that data, dive deep into the data, close to 20,000 observations, over 20,000 observations, to examine what variables geographically are responsible, if you will, for high road mortality versus low road mortality. So for the first objective then, we split the data into 5 taxonomic groups. Frogs, which we just called frogs. Unfortunately, frogs, when they're hit by cars, do not last very long, and they're notoriously difficult to identify to a species level. They're just obliterated. But we can identify them as frogs, but whether it's a green frog, a bullfrog, we're just not sure. So we lumped them together and included toads in that group as well. The second group was turtles, but we split out Midland painted turtles from this group. They were the most abundant species of turtle, so we treated them separately. In many studies of amphibian and reptile mortality, turtles are just lumped together, but because of the depth of this data, we could split out our most abundant species, which was painted turtles. And we did the same for snakes. We were able to split out our most abundant species, which were northern water snakes, and examine them on a species level and compare them to the other groups of snakes. And just to illustrate how we went about doing this, this is a little portion of the Thousand Islands Parkway, and you can see the different dots representing an individual animal. In this case, these were turtles. And the kernel density estimator is applied to this to estimate the actual density of animals that we would anticipate finding. So color-coded here for red equaling areas of highest mortality, blue equaling areas where there's very little, or in this case, no mortality at all. And so we're left with a continuous field of data rather than just saying, here are where the animals were found. We're left with a range of values from our highest to our lowest. So we use that to map these hotspots, but we also use that data to then model the variables that might be responsible for high or low road mortality. And we developed 20 different models, so 5 different taxa across the 2 roads, and we did it for 2 different scales. And I'll illustrate the scale concept here. At a number of random points along the roadway, we drew circles within a geographic information system at 2 different radii. One 50-meter radii, so less than a hectare in size, and the other 250-meter radius, 20 hectares, or for our American friends, about 50 acres. Okay, and within each of those circles, we identified the relative amount of different habitat types on the landscape. This much was swamp, this much was forest, this much was agricultural areas. We also looked at a number of variables like the distance to the nearest culvert, or distance to a waterway, or distance to an intersection. So at these two different scales, 50-meter scale and 250-meter scale, we had 12 different variables that we examined. Traffic volume was one of them. We had traffic volume measurements for these different roads. You can see at the 50-meter scale, we had a number of distance to measures, and then some generalized habitat or land cover metrics. At the 250-meter scale, we drilled down a little further and got a bit more detailed in terms of those land cover metrics, and we also included things like habitat diversity and habitat connectivity at the 250-meter scale. I'm only going to present results for the 250-meter scale for the rest of the talk, just for expediency and limitations of time. So I'm going to show you 5 slides that look just like this, and these are our results. This is the hotspot mapping at the top, and this is for frogs. You can see here, here's Thousand Islands Parkway, and here's County Road 2. The red equaling the highest areas of road mortality, and the blue equaling these cold spots. So now you can start to pick out these zones where there are areas of high mortality for these different taxonomic groups. And then below the map are the different models, the 2 different models at 250-meter scale, one for the Parkway, one for County Road 2. We used regression tree modeling. It's a statistical technique, but it also spits out, if you will, a tree, a visual interpretation of your model. And for the biologists in the room, this is like a dichotomous key, where we start with all our data at the top and we increasingly divide it into homogeneous subgroups. The most important variable in the model is always at the top. So that variable explains the most variation in your data. And then as you go down, your data top here. So just to give you a sense of how you would interpret this, here we'd say swamp. And the amount of swamp within this 50-acre area around a particular point on the road is the most important variable on County Road 2 for determining how much roadkill we have. In this case, if you have anything over 20% of the adjacent landscape being swamp, you're going to have a very high amount of roadkill. So we go to the right if the statement is true, we go to the left if the statement is negative. If we have less than 20%, we come over here, and as you can see, this model gets fine-tuned by these other variables. Circuit meaning landscape connectivity or circuitscape score, and you can work your way down. So 20% seems to be a bit of a threshold here for frogs. If you have over 20% wetland, you're going to have a lot of frog mortality. Variables are different over on the Thousand Islands Parkway. Traffic comes up as the #1 predictor. Counterintuitively, though, lower traffic leads to higher mortality. You might be scratching your head wondering, well, how does that work? Are cars actually responsible for killing these animals? Yeah, it's true. We had to take our time to think through that one, and I'll get to it at the end here. But this model is further refined by the amount of open wetland on the landscape. And again, you've got about 1/5 of the landscape here. Anything over than that, you're going to have a higher amount of road mortality. Okay, so now I've walked you through those. I'll quickly go through these other graphics here, and you can sort of see up on the top here for painted turtles, red areas are these hot spots. Blue areas are these cooler spots. And you'll see for painted turtles on County Road #2, open wetland is the most important variable. Greater than 1.3%, which is not a lot. If you have a little bit of open wetland, meaning marshland or shallow open water, you're going to have the highest amount of painted turtle mortality. It's not a lot of wetland to be thinking about. On the Thousand Islands Parkway, we have a much more complicated model here. A lot more variables come into play, but water is important for painted turtles. Makes sense. Turtles like water. We find turtles around water. So it's kind of nice to know that, hey, wetlands and water, it's kind of making sense here. For the other species of turtles, Blanding's turtles, stink pots, snapping turtles, all lumped together here, County Road 2, we see swamp coming up again. And there's that threshold again, 21%. Over on the Thousand Islands Parkway, little different, habitat diversity comes into play. Where there's a lot of different habitat types on a landscape, we tend to have higher amounts of roadkill. The explanatory power of this model, though, is only 21%. So it's not a particularly great model. For snakes, water snakes, our dominant species of snake, here we see on County Road 2, swamp comes out again. Open wetland on the Thousand Islands Parkway. So seeing a theme emerge here, water and wetlands becoming really important. Kind of makes sense for water snakes. As their name implies, they gravitate to areas of water. But interestingly, for our other snake species, water does not come out on top, nor does wetlands. In fact, it's not found in any of these different models. These are species like the gray rat snake, like eastern garter snake, the Kay's brown snake, that don't rely on open water bodies as much as water snake does. So we see deciduous forest coming into play here, and the amount of roads in a particular area. We spend a lot of time, obviously, going through these models, interpreting what they mean and some of the nuances around them. But I just want to sort of summarize some of the more salient points here for you. One is that clustering is evident for all of these 5 taxonomic groups. That wasn't necessarily something we knew going into this whole data collection effort, right? We could have even numbers of roadkill along a roadway. You could go along and say, every 50 meters find a turtle, or every 100 meters find a snake. We didn't find that. We found clear clustering and areas that we tend to call hotspots. The clustering, though, was not as discrete, so not as sort of pronounced, if you will, on the Thousand Islands Parkway, nor was it as discrete for the snakes, and in particular the other snakes. Second, roadkill, as I mentioned going through those regression trees, it's strongly associated with the amount and proximity to water and wetlands on a landscape. And if you have just a little bit of wetland, in terms of open wetland, marshes and open shallow water bodies, that can lead to high amounts of roadkill. So it's something for us to be cognizant of in terms of road planning and mitigation efforts. There were, though, within these models, some real notable differences amongst taxa, so amongst these 5 different groups, between these 2 roadways, and interestingly, from a landscape ecological perspective, between scales as well. So what matters at a small scale may not be what matters at a big scale. We did test some novel variables in our modeling. Habitat connectivity, I'm not aware of others who have done this, looking at sort of large-scale habitat connectivity as an independent variable in their models. And we found that it was important at the 250-meter scale. Habitat diversity as well. We measured the differences between roadsides. So why did the chicken cross the road? Was it to find something cool on the other side? Not necessarily, because roadside dissimilarity didn't come out as being an important variable in our models. So if you had wetland on one side of the road, but no wetland on the other side of the road, you might imagine, well, turtles trying to get from the no wetland side to the wetland side. There's no evidence that that was really predominating the locations of roadkill, at least on these 2 roads. So finally, what are the implications here for road ecology, conservation, and the A2A region in general? Well, hotspots, I think, can be used to guide mitigation and mitigation efforts, but we also need to consider habitat. Hotspots and habitat usually do coincide, but not always. Wetlands and water, really important, at least for reptiles, amphibians, and reptiles. But we need to use caution when extrapolating. So when we say this is really great for turtles, well, okay, it may be really great for all turtles, but if we say this is really great for snakes, it may not be great for all snakes, because all these different species of snakes have different habitat requirements. So we want to think beyond the generalization here. And finally, it's really, I think, rewarding as a professor and somebody who supervises graduate students to see the results of graduate student research being used in conservation efforts. So A2A now is using these results in guiding a regional ecological road ecology strategy and using it to guide monitoring, or to identify monitoring locations within Leeds and Grenville. And for me to see, these are studies that my students have been involved in, and to know that it's not just collecting dust on a shelf, it's really great. So that's been really one of the true rewards for me in working with A2A on these projects. And at that, I'll say thanks to A2A for all their ongoing efforts, but also to Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry, Parks Canada, and the Natural Sciences and Engineering Research Council for funding of these data collection efforts. Thanks.
And I apologize for mispronouncing his name once again. Jochen Jaeger of Concordia University, who is also doing some leading road ecology work. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for the introduction. Coming up. Yes. So this connects very nicely. Look for some similarities. I'm talking about predicting zones of potential high turtle presence zones along roads in Quebec. And the research team included Steffi Velosa and Cassidy McDonald, who did the real work. We got funding from the Ministère des Forêts, de la Faune et des Parcs. They changed their name recently, so now they are Ministère de l'Environnement, Lutte contre les changements climatiques, Faune et Parcs. I will present the objectives, then methods, then the results, and then the website that presents the predictions that our statistical models are making. We have 7 turtle species in Quebec. All of them are endangered to some degree at least, and we used the study area, included the range of the wood turtles in Quebec because it includes more or less all the other turtle species as well. You see those areas in green here. We did not include the island of Montreal and Ile de Jésus for Laval and Quebec City because there's so many roads and not so many turtles. And we want not to have too many road segments. It's a lot already. We use the data that we got from the ministry. It's called the BORAC, Banque d'Observation des Reptiles et des Amphibiens du Québec, which includes 80% of those are from professionals and 20% from citizen science, then verified by people at the ministry. It includes 29,000 data entries with 1 or more turtles reported. The accuracy is pretty good, less than 150 meters. It started in 1946. Of course, the precision is higher today. We removed duplicate entries, and then we created segments of 100 meters along the entire road network within the study range, and counted the turtle observations in there by creating buffers around the roads with different widths. You can see that here, right? So each segment here has the buffers around them. If it's 1 or 2 lanes, it was 25 meters on either side, up to 7 lanes, which would then have 50 meters on either side. So either the turtles were on the road or very close to it, in the vicinity of it. And that way, we created 1.7 million road segments that covered 169,700 kilometers out of a total of 181,600 kilometers. So most of it, not all of it though. And that way we found 2,583 road segments that had 1 or more turtles on it, reported. You see the frequencies of turtles here. Most of them have 1 turtle reported. 420 road segments have 2 turtles, and a few road segments more than that even. And here's a map of how they were distributed across the wood turtle range. And then we chose 207,000 control segments, which are just random locations along the road segment, but far enough from the turtle segments and also far enough from other control segments that they are considered independent observations, so we don't have to worry about statistical or spatial autocorrelation. And then we thought what environmental variables to include and what road variables. And there are some things in common with Ryan's talk here and some differences. So we were thinking about watercourse intersections, water body intersections, wetlands intersections. Then we measured distance to the next suitable habitat, which would be water or marsh. Then the density of linear watercourses in 5 buffer rings, 100 meters, 200 meters, 300 meters, 400 meters, and 500 meters, because we were not sure which scale would be most relevant. And then in the same buffer rings, we also considered 10 land cover types: peatlands, marshlands, swamplands, forest, perennial agriculture, intensive agriculture, other agriculture, developed open space, and anthropogenic nesting sites. And then said, what's the percentage of these land cover types within the buffers? Causeway locations we also considered. And then structural variables for the roads included whether the road was paved or unpaved, what the road class was, what the speed limit was on the road, and the number of lanes. We were unable to include traffic volumes because they don't exist for all the roads. For some roads they do exist, but not for all of them. So it looks like this. For every one of these 1.7 million road segments, we have these 5 buffers around it. Then we used statistical analysis. I spare you the details, but just for those who are interested, some idea. First, we had to consider whether some variables are so much correlated that they cannot be used independently at the same time. So we used variance inflation factors to decide which ones we can include. So for example, for the road variables, 2 variables were always super closely related to the other 2, so we could only keep 2 road variables at the same time. We used 80% of the data first to train our statistical models and use them to compare with their predictions with the other 20% of the data to find out how accurate are our models. And I will show you the results in 2 minutes. So we have 4 training models, either using the counts of the turtles or using a logistic model that says whether there was a turtle or not, regardless of the numbers of the turtles there. And then afterwards we combine all the data again, ran the statistical models again to get complete models, for which then of course we cannot do any accuracy testing anymore, because it includes already all the data. We used R, GLM models using Poisson and binomial distributions, and using AIC, archaic information criterion, to determine which model is the best. Here are the results. So all of these models included between 10 and 19 variables. Once we created the complete models, they were very similar to the training models, so there were slight differences, but not much. Causeways was only retained in one of these models because the other variables already covered it, so there was a lot of multicollinearity. That's why causeways doesn't show up in all of the models. Here's one example about the most important variables. So I just show you the 3 most important variables. For the first model, it was the road class, the distance to suitable habitat, and amount of intensive agriculture within a 300-meter buffer. For the second one, it was again road class, intensive agriculture within 200 meters, other agricultural within 300 meters. And then for the 2 logistic models, again, distance to suitable habitat and road class were important. Then amount of marge in this ring between 400 and 500 meters, water within 200 meters. So there were similar variables that show up all the time, basically. Now you can use those to make predictions. The count models make predictions for the number of turtles between 0 and 4.66, and the logistic models, of course, between 0 and 1 turtle predicted. So you have all these equations in our report, so anybody can take those equations and use them to make predictions for their favorite road that they're interested in. All the coefficients are here. This model includes 11 variables, for example, here. When we had our training models and made predictions, you see the prediction on the left there, either 1 or 0, and compared that with the test data that we had, we found that 40.5% of the positive predictions and 38.1% of the negative predictions were correct. So overall, we had an accuracy of 78.6 correct predictions. That's not so bad, considering it's all turtles combined and they have specific different requirements partly. So, and then we made all these predictions for the entire turtle range there, wood turtle range. And then we thought, how are we going to show this? A big map that would cover an entire wall may not be the best option. So Cassidy said, I can program this on a website. So he took the map of Quebec and indicates for each 100-meter road segment what's the predicted potential probability of turtle presence, where you see in these light colors, yellow and red, a high probability of turtles being present, at least based on the conditions of the landscape and the road characteristics, and purple locations have very low probability. You see that? And one feature sticks out right away. As soon as you have water in the vicinity, the predictions are usually high for turtle presence. And that's similar to Ryan's results. Water, as soon as you have waters or wetlands, there is a high probability that turtles could be there. This is Highway 10 between Lac Waterloo and Lac Brome and the surrounding network. Here's another example. This is Chambly, southeast of Montreal and adjacent to the Richelieu River. You see very nicely all these 100-meter road segments. Here's one where we zoom in a little more. Again, you see all these road segments. Sometimes when we have intersections, then the road segments don't add up exactly to 100 meters all the time. So some road segments were just 30 meters, and we did not include those. Here's another one. So here we included some real turtle observations as green spots. That's why I'm not supposed to tell you where this is in Quebec, to keep it secret. And I also considered these turtles themselves are too far away from the road to be actually included in the model. They are further away than 25 meters. So they are just for comparison. You see the locations and the predictions make total sense. They agree, even though they were independent. We also compared between the models, like here's the best logistic complete 1 and 2 models. And for large areas, it's similar colors for the predictions. All over here. But for some locations, you see some slight differences, right? So here, it's a bit brighter for that model than compared to the other model on the other side. But in general, they were pretty close. So there are some minor differences in predictions between the 4 models. And the advantage is now, if you don't trust one model too much, you can look at all 4 models, compare the predictions, and if they all agree, then you're pretty certain that's a solid prediction. And then Cassidy programmed this website. So we have these heat maps, we have the predictions, also the confusion matrices for the accuracies are shown, and then clusters. So I will go step by step here. Let's look at this one. So this is for the predictions, where you as the user can choose the threshold, 0.95 for the first logistic model, and then all the road segments show up with a red dot around Montreal. Remember, we did not include Montreal and Laval because of too many roads, but all around. You can see that, and when you now change the slider to say 80%, many more locations will show up. So that's where you have full control. You can hover over each of these locations with your cursor there, and then a little window shows up that shows you all the predictions. So for the first prediction here it's 0.88, for the second 0.92, and so on. We have a model average as well. And then whether the segment, road segment itself, was a segment where turtles were reported, and if so, how many turtles were reported, or whether it was maybe a control segment in the statistical model, or whether it was not included there, then it's just NA. So this website includes more than 1.7 million predictions accordingly. When you go to the top of the website with your cursor, then you get into a 3-dimensional view, so you can fly over the landscape and see all these predictions for the particular threshold that you're choosing. So this is a 3-dimensional representation of the topography surrounding Lac Orford. And you see Autoroute 10 here in the front and Route 112 in the background there. So now you have all these locations, and when you want to go there and figure out where to mitigate, it would be nice to have a tool that tells you where many observations are close to each other. So you can go to one of these locations and walk to the other locations rather than using your car all over the place. So Cassidy said, I can do clusters. And he did that. So this would then be clusters that show up in the same color once they're 4 or more road segments closer to each other than 1,000 meters. Here for a threshold chosen by the user of more than 0.90. Again, this is Eastman displaying the region's clusters. So if you want to look at them, you can just park, you stop your car in one of these clusters and walk to the others. And then you know how big are these areas with lots of turtle predictions that are higher than your chosen threshold. And when you see that, there are lots of locations across Quebec where there could be turtles. Maybe we should say should be turtles. Habitat conditions are good for them. Maybe some of these locations don't have turtles, in fact, but maybe they were there like 30 or 40 or 50 years ago, and they went extinct for various reasons, including the road traffic. They could be brought back. If you mitigate the road, then you can bring back these turtles, use that habitat again. This is in a way also a suitability map of where you could have turtles if they are not there anymore. We're working with Cooridor Laurentien, north of Montreal. They were mentioned in Marie-André's presentation earlier this morning. And for this area, I just took a screenshot of the model here for predictions higher than 90% for the clusters in this area. So you see Montreal would be down here. This is Saint-Jérôme. Blainville, where Jonathan lives, is right here. And then further to the north is Mont-Tremblant. And you see lots of locations, again, where there could be turtles. And again, if there are no turtles today, could be there if some road mitigation measures were taken. So far, there's almost nothing in Quebec for turtles. There are a handful of protection, but other than that, I'm not aware of much that has been done, unfortunately, and it would be important to do that. And we hope that this work may help inspire people to do that. So conclusions, all the predictive variables were actually in the model as predicted, which is good, so they all make ecological sense. The distance to suitable habitat was always the first or second most important variable in the two models that included it. All four models are good at making predictions. They're all close to 80%. Maybe the best one was the second complete logistic model. The scales differed, so we did not have just one scale. All the 5 scales occurred for some variables, so all these scales are good to consider. And as a result, now many locations need attention for protecting turtles. What are the next steps for us? We would like to do some refinements to the website. We're currently hoping to, or working on translating the website into French so it can be used by hopefully the Transport Ministry as well, but the Environment Ministry people. We want to publish a paper. We consider maybe if we have more funding at some point, it could be interesting to redo the analysis by species. Remember, this is all species combined. We hope the website can be made public if the ministry will allow us to do that. If it's species specific, it's unlikely to be publicly available because they want to protect the turtles, right? One big discussion was traffic volumes. Should the traffic volumes be there? And I was always worried we should have traffic volumes in there. And Ryan's work showed that traffic volumes were important in that model. But on the other hand, one student told me, wait a second, the turtles would just go there and try to cross regardless of the number of cars on the road. Once they try to cross, the danger of getting killed or injured, that depends on traffic volumes. But just for being there and having presence zones predicted, maybe traffic volume is pretty irrelevant. So that's an argument that I think convinced me partly. Of course, it would be nice to rerun the work in the models once traffic volumes might be available, but maybe it's not such a big problem. And then, of course, for government, ministries, and NGOs, the mitigation should be done while the turtles are still there. Many turtle populations are declining, as you know. I also want to make a bit advertisement for our special issue we just published in this journal, Impact Assessment and Project Appraisal, which asks the question, how is landscape connectivity considered in environmental impact assessment? I think this is crucial. We have now hundreds and hundreds of publications on ecological connectivity. But this will be relevant only when it really is considered seriously environmental impact assessment, and that's currently not the case, or only rarely the case, in particular if there's a public outcry. Other than that, like my student Charla Patterson looked at 14 EAAs in Canada, and it was marginal. I can't say complete luck, but very little consideration with really basic methods that is not, like nobody used circle scale, for example, right? So this needs to be improved if this research should have a positive impact. And you see those papers? This is the editorial here with an overview that Aurora put together. I also mentioned to balance this with some interesting, fun information. There's a new book out there by Daryl Jones, Professor Emeritus from Australia, about road ecology. It just came out in May. It's called A Clouded Leopard in the Middle of the Road. It's a strange title, I find, but it's really about a publicly accessible summary of the history of road ecology out there. This is a clouded leopard. It doesn't have much to do with clouded leopards, but it's a fantastic species. Their tail is longer than their body, for example, and they're endangered, and it's a nice book. It's very nice to read, this book, so I highly recommend that. And with this, I would like to thank you for your attention. Our collaborators, it was very enjoyable to work together with Johan Dubois, Jason Sampson, and Louis Buisson-Gauthier from the MFFP on their new name. And with this, I would be happy to answer any questions.
So my name is Caitlin Drasher. I'm a graduate student at the University of Vermont in the US. And I recently worked on a connectivity modeling project with a great team in Vermont to assess the value of transportation structures for wildlife connectivity. And I know we're outside the A2A region, but hopefully some of the tools we use and the methods that we used might be useful in other areas. But we used electrical circuit theory models to look at the movement of multiple important species in Vermont to ultimately rank our existing transportation structures by their connectivity value for wildlife. And so just some quick acknowledgements here. This project wouldn't have been possible without funding from the Vermont Agency of Transportation, or VTrans. The research was a collaboration between VTrans, the Nature Conservancy in Vermont, the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department, and the University of Vermont. And we had some help with our modeling from conservation science partners. And we're also working on expanding these connectivity models right now outside of Vermont into New Hampshire and Maine with some funding from the Northeastern States Research Cooperative, which I'll hopefully quickly mention at the end. So beginning with some regional context on issues of landscape connectivity in the northeastern US. This map shows the northern Appalachian Acadian ecoregion. I'm sure many folks are familiar with, but it covers 330,000 square kilometers through the northeastern US and southeastern Canada. Very ecologically rich region with many habitat types critical for supporting the movement of wildlife species. And there have been multiple priority linkage areas identified for wildlife in the region, like the ones shown here from the Staying Connected initiative. And 6 of these linkage areas actually fall into parts of Vermont. So again, just a very important region for maintaining connectivity, especially as the climate changes and as species continue to shift their ranges to follow those associated habitat changes. And some background on connectivity and transportation issues in Vermont. Vermont's a very rural state. We're about 78% forested, but definitely not immune to habitat fragmentation. There are over 25,000 kilometers of road in Vermont, and the public drives an estimated 11.4 billion kilometers annually on these roads. We also have over 88,000 state-managed transportation structures, so culverts, bridges, underpasses, even really small drainage pipes are included in that. And just about 6,000 of these structures are large enough, potentially, for some species to cross through, which I'll return to in a minute. But roads present some real concerns for terrestrial wildlife populations, so they can lead to direct mortality for animals, obviously, through wildlife vehicle collisions, which are costly and dangerous for us humans. But they also lead to indirect mortality for wildlife. So the fragmentation of habitat prevents species from accessing important resources that they need, leads to less dispersal, less genetic exchange across the landscape, which can impact population viability over time. And again, this is a huge concern as the climate changes and as species need to shift their ranges and inevitably need to cross a whole bunch of roads to do that. So one way to make our road barriers more permeable for wildlife movement, as you all know, is through the use of transportation structures like culverts, bridges, and underpasses. And thankfully, all road networks have existing structures. Some are already helping wildlife cross the road in their current condition. Might be a little hard to see, but there's a bobcat moving through a big round culvert there. And others have the potential to do this with some modifications. So we can do a lot with what we already have, which is great, but we do need to improve some of these structures to make them more appealing and usable for wildlife. And in a small state like Vermont with limited funding, we really need to prioritize these types of investments to wildlife-friendly infrastructure to areas of the road network that are most benefiting multiple species if possible. So I mentioned we have about 6,000 structures in Vermont that are potentially large enough for species to cross through. These are all of our state-managed structures that are greater than 3 feet in diameter. So VTrans wanted a way to figure out which of these 6,000 structures are most important for wildlife movement and connectivity. And in fact, they wanted a way to numerically rank these structures by their connectivity value for multiple important species. So that way, when a construction project comes up anyway, they can check this list of rankings, see how it scores for wildlife, and whether or not they should invest that money in that location. And so we have 8 terrestrial mammal species that we focused on, so we're taking a break from the herps, but moving into some charismatic megafauna here. But these species were chosen for a few reasons. They all have cultural, ecological, and economic importance in Vermont. The larger body mammals like bear, moose, and deer are especially iconic in our state, but they're also some of the more wide-ranging species that frequently encounter roadways and obviously pose a huge risk to motorists. So these are the ones that VTrans wanted to include. And so the goal of this work was to rank those roughly 6,000 structures by their overall connectivity value for these species, or try to figure out how important they are based on their location in the landscape and whether or not they fall within predicted movement paths. So to do this, our approach was to first model the movements of each of these species throughout Vermont, as well as at a finer scale around each individual transportation structure. And we also compiled some data on the structures themselves, such as their current condition, whether or not they're surrounded by protected lands. And then we ranked each structure by all of these different metrics using a decision-making framework that we named the Vermont Terrestrial Passage Screening Tool. So this tool just gives us that numerical ranking for all of these structures that VTrans is using when they're making decisions about prioritizing wildlife infrastructure improvements. And so we used electrical circuit theory to model wildlife movement. This method just treats movement of animals like the flow of electricity in a circuit. So the landscape serves as the circuit, and it's made up of all of these different resistances, which channels the flow of electricity or wildlife, typically through less resistant paths in the landscape. And so in Vermont, our circuit is made up of things like agriculture, human development, forest, roads, etc. And each land cover type has its own resistance value associated with the movement of different species. And this is because different species have very different movement behaviors, right? So the resistances in our circuit for a raccoon look a lot different than our resistances in a circuit for a deer, for example. And we used a tool called Omniscape to model these species movements. It was developed by folks at the Nature Conservancy, sort of a newer version of CircuitScape that allows the electricity to flow in all directions. And we modeled the movements of our 8 species individually using Omniscape at 2 spatial scales. So first, we modeled the broader landscape level movements of each species throughout Vermont. An example of that is shown here on the left. And next, we modeled the more fine-scale movements of species around each individual transportation structure using really high-resolution, half-meter land cover data. An example of that is shown on the right. So we have these 2 scales, the landscape scale and the structure scale. And I'm just going to walk through a little visualization of this modeling process for both of the scales. So we have 2 main inputs that we need to run Omniscape. The first is called the source strength input. So this tells us where the electricity or where the wildlife are coming from in the landscape. The second is the landscape resistance input, which represents those resistances in our circuit. So this layer contains all of the land cover variables that are scored according to their relative resistance to the movement of the species, or how difficult it is to move through. So Omniscape is essentially stacking that resistance map on top of the source strength map. The source strength map is injecting species electricity into that resistance map, and then the species then travel around the landscape most frequently in areas that are less resistant for them to move. So areas of increased predicted wildlife movement have a higher electrical current density, especially pinch points, and that is shown in those yellow areas in the maps on the right. And just to dig into those inputs a little bit more, starting with the source strength layer, we used existing wildlife occurrence or occupancy data for this input to tell us where in the landscape our species electricity is coming from. And these data are from Pierman Gilman et al., another UVM graduate student, and resulted from a really extensive expert opinion survey across the northeastern US. But these occupancy maps tell us the probability of occurrence of a species in each location or each pixel of our map in the landscape. So in Omniscape, this tells us where the electricity is starting from, but it also tells us how much electricity is coming out of each location. So for example, an area that has a 90% probability of moose occurrence is going to spit out more electricity than an area that only has a 10% probability of moose occurrence. And then we have that landscape this is just a table of those resistance values for each species at that landscape scale. We use the National Land Cover data set for this, but they did score variables in our Vermont high resolution land cover data set for the structure scale. But essentially, they assigned a numerical value to all of these different land cover types at this 30-meter resolution National Land Cover data set for this scale. All right, so when we combine the source strength and the resistance inputs, these are what the final Omniscape maps look like for each species individually, as well as all species combined, just added together on the right. So to summarize these landscape scale results and quantify connectivity, we calculated the average amount of electrical current density within a 1 kilometer radius of each transportation structure from each of the species maps. And then we added those results together to get an all species average at each transportation structure. Then we also ran the really high resolution structure scale models. So for these, we ran Omniscape in a 100-meter radius of each structure. Again, we took the average electrical current density from each species map and added them together for an all species result at each structure. And a little shout out to our supercomputer at UVM, the Blue Moon cluster. We did have to run this on a supercomputer because of the high resolution data. Definitely really computationally intensive. But these high resolution models really capture some fine scale habitats at the structures that species will move through that are not necessarily captured at the full 30-meter resolution that we ran the whole state at. So for example, bobcats will often travel along hedgerows in agricultural areas. And so we were able to visualize potential bobcat movement. You can see lighting up along that hedgerow approaching a transportation structure by using this land cover data. Definitely took some years off my life though, stressing about the supercomputer. All right, so that was a lot of information about our connectivity models, but I just want to quickly mention a few other metrics that we included in our rankings. So we had some additional analyses that were really spearheaded by our TNC Vermont chapter. So they compiled data on the attributes, condition, and different attributes important for wildlife, like the length of a structure and the bank full width ratio. They also calculated the influence of human development surrounding structures, buffering 50 meters around each building footprint to try to account for human activity around the buildings, not just the buildings themselves. And finally, we also had a calculation for the amount and location of protected lands around structures. So this is really of interest since these lands will probably not experience much human development into the future. So a structure that has large blocks of protected land on both sides of the roadway would kind of be a bonus for them to add wildlife improvements to, because they know their investment's going to last through time. And then all of these data feed into our terrestrial passage screening tool. It's very user-friendly, it's just built in Microsoft Excel, and it's formatted as a linear programming decision-making framework. So this spreadsheet takes in all the raw data from all of the different analyses, it normalizes the data so they're all on the same scale, and then it uses the normalized data to rank structures in 3 different ways to inform management. So the first wildlife movement priority rank, this is really the most important one for considering wildlife movement. So it includes the results from the Omniscape maps, the connectivity analyses, as well as that human development metric that I very quickly mentioned. But this rank just tells us whether a structure is a priority for wildlife movement. So if a structure scores well here, it could be a good candidate for wildlife improvements because the species are predicted to be moving in the vicinity of that structure. But we also have 2 additional ranks. So this second structure characteristics rank evaluates the condition of the structure for wildlife based on the length and the bank full width ratio. So if a structure scores poorly here, it probably needs those updates to make it more wildlife friendly. And then this third protected lands rank assesses the amount and the location of protected lands around each structure. So structures with large blocks of protected land on both sides of the roadway score the best here. And those locations are really beneficial for connectivity through time. So to sum up, these 3 rankings ultimately provide information on wildlife movement, structure condition, and nearby protected lands that are helping VTrans make these decisions about prioritizing those costly wildlife improvements. And And then here are the top 100 structure locations just for that first wildlife movement priority rank. This is for all species combined, which is how VTrans chose to use this data. But these are some of the places where wildlife are most likely to encounter an existing structure based on their movement patterns. And then on the right, I also just have a map that shows the average electrical current density within 1 kilometer radius of each structure from the landscape scale analysis. Then in order to ultimately assess the structure rankings, we thankfully had 7 years of game camera data where our partners set up game cameras beneath 50 transportation structures to assess wildlife use. So we just did a simple assessment of the probability of presence of some of these species based on the camera data collected at these structures. It was generally high for both ungulate and carnivore groups. They chose these structures because they thought they would be good for wildlife movement. And so we would expect that the landscape scale and structure scale connectivity scores should also be high as well, that electrical current density at these spots. And you can see from these graphs here, the connectivity scores for these structures were high, around 70 to 80%, as were the probability of carnivore and ungulate presence, just to group those out based on the data. So then what do these structure rankings actually lead to? There are many different things we can do to make structures more appealing and usable for wildlife. So for example, VTrans might decide to change the substrate of a structure. This image here shows a bridge location that has a ton of boulders under it as that movement surface. And while that's great for this groundhog that actually lives amongst all of these boulders, it's not so great for deer, which sometimes choose to walk through rivers instead of over those large boulders, and also over roadways instead of over those boulders. So to improve a structure for deer, we can fill in those boulders with other material, make it a more even surface to walk on. On the other hand, if there's a lot of water going through a structure, bobcats will sometimes opt to use these narrow shells that help them pass through without stepping through the water. So that's something that can be pretty easily added to structures as well. And those are just a couple of examples of what can be done with the rankings, but again, the ultimate goal of this project was to help prioritize these types of investments to areas of the road network that is seeing the most wildlife use, the most wildlife traffic moving through. And then after wrapping this project up, we just received some additional funding to expand our connectivity modeling outside of Vermont into New Hampshire and Maine. So we're actually building new circuit-based models of gene flow through northern New England, and we're creating new resistance layers using genetic data from samples that we've collected from harvested and roadkill animals in the region. And so the ultimate goal is for these gene flow models to help inform land and species management to maintain genetic connectivity across the landscape, in this time of increased human development, fragmentation, and climate change. And so you can email me any questions if we don't have time for questions, and I'm happy to chat afterward, but thanks for listening.
Wildlife technician, barely making enough money. Had to work nighttime as a projectionist, and I worked as a stagehand in Syracuse, and I made more money as a stagehand than I did as a fish and wildlife technician. And then this opportunity came up at DOT, and it was double the pay, it had benefits, and wow, and it was exciting. And like I said, the first couple of years I thought, what a mistake, but I was there, retired almost 2 years coming this August, and it was probably one of the best things I ever did. And yet, I wasn't singing with the choir, and I learned to get the choir to be more diverse, and I'm going to talk about some of that. Now, what I'm going to talk about, what I have way too many slides, and people at my work used to always call my talks, not TED Talks, they call them Ed Talks. This had a lot of stuff, but I'm hoping there's value here, and it's going to touch on things you've heard so far, and I'm hoping, again, it helps somebody with maybe an idea, and I'm going to give broad perspectives, and like I said, I got a lot of slides, but a lot of it's front-loaded. I'm going to go quick on things. I'm going to run out of time, and we're going to get to a point, but that's fine. And then we're going to, in the panel, I might be able to bring up some more things. But I want to hit some key points. And does this clicker work here, John?
All right, so...
all right, let me just see.
Work?
Let me see. Do I have to hit the button? I mean, I could do that, too.
What's the alternative that you're on? I was just hitting space, I think.
You're hitting what?
I think it was the space bar. Yeah.
There we go. All right, so let me just, start. I mean, we've come, when I talk about things I'm talking about, there's a lot of variables, and there's a lot of positives, and a lot of times I got to be careful, because some people think I'm just bringing out the negative. No, I'm not. There's positives. But when I started in this business, I remember bringing up the idea of a wildlife crossing in the late 90s, and I remember being laughed at. I was in a room with like 25 engineers, and they're all laughing. I'm like, it wasn't funny, but they're laughing at me. And this is the mindset. This is on the Northway in the Adirondacks. You throw up a road sign, and we're good to go. And, you know, that mindset is kind of crazy. But on the same token, we can't do everything everywhere. So this is like one of my, I just happen to be, I go out west every year hunting, but I also go out and I spend a week or two and I go look at things that are going on. I got misled and I was in Colorado, but I saw this sign for the Sand Creek Massacre site. And again, what a horrific thing, what a terrible time in U.S. history, what happened to the Cheyennes and Arapaho there. But I wanted to go see this site. But I go into this, it's 10 miles of road and there's nothing. And I get there and there's 3 cars in the parking lot. And I come out of the parking lot and boom, that rattlesnake wasn't there when I came through. And I don't know how many of you, raise your hands, how many of you were like zealot, roadkill observers, like, you know, you see something, you're like going down the road, like, oh, thankful that was a jacket. You know, no, but like this morning, I'm going across the Thousand Island Bridge and I see something, red fox. Now I'm like, park the car right in the middle of the road, I'm taking pictures and I'm thinking of my story in case the park police, somebody gets me. I'm going to tell them, well, I'm broke down, but I had to get a picture of that red fox in the bridge. And so I'm always taking pictures and I use them in presentations. But again, we can't fix this. But again, what's the chances of that happening? And that happened, you know, within the hour I was at this site. A couple of weeks ago, I was at this site. And every one of these ones, I want to look at aerials afterwards. There's always a story. But I have a lot of history and stuff in Florida. And I work for a company also. I worked for DOT for almost 25 years. I've had my own environmental business for 20 years. I did that sideline when I was working at DOT. I had to go through all the ethics. Every year I had to get ethics approved. But me and my wife decided it was best for our family to basically start a firm. My wife stopped working. We had 3 kids. Best thing we did. Our kids were at home. But I picked up the business. My wife has helped. But I also work for Sam Schwartz Engineering. We have an office in Tampa, we have one in New York City, we have one in Chicago, Los Angeles. But anyhow, I was down here, we're looking at a project, but this is the area, my wife, you know, we're going to the beach, and I'm like, you know, this is 4-lane highway, but they clear cut the center median 10 years ago, and I sent an email to Florida, and I was like, why are you doing that? And they said, oh, stormwater. And this is another one of these real crazy things, that the environmental poles are, you know, they don't always align, but they've created all of this habitat for alligators that they can't get there, and I see roadkills there all the time. Where did it start for me? My grandfather, I grew up trapping, and you might say, whoa, man, how could you be a trapper? And my grandfather taught me trapping when I was a kid. I was also grew up hunting. I grew up in a hunting family. My dad was from Pennsylvania. The only day I could ever skip school was opening day of deer season. Don't go skipping school any other day. But my grandfather taught me something. You want to learn what a fox does, follow it. And I would spend my days following wildlife. And so this starts when I was a kid, but if you ever want to see what wildlife do, and we're lucky we got snow, it's a lot easier to track them, but there's so much you can learn from wildlife by just spending a day on a track. So let me just get into this a little bit here. What I've observed throughout my career is that there's several things. Can you give me like a 5-minute notice so I know that I'm like, because I have till 3, right?
Well, technically, we're at the coffee break, but...
Coffee break?
If I'm reading this right.
I thought it said it had till 3.
No, I mean, keep going, keep going.
All right. So anyhow, what I've seen throughout my career, there's these passionate, dedicated people. They're in Canada, they're in Vermont, they're in Maine, and I know a lot of them all over the country. There's economic and regional champions, like what's going on in Jackson Hole, Wyoming right now. And I'll show you a few pictures if we get to it. But we also get people to get educated. It's not going to be do that, we can duplicate it. And then there's a public interest, an organization that drives something. And then there's a legal reason. The problem in transportation, what I've seen is there's no laws that make you do this stuff. Unless there's a threatened endangered species, it's kind of an afterthought unless you have a champion, a group, or somebody that buys into it, and it varies. And just like when I walked out the door, you know, I try to build that into the organization. I knew I was going to be retired. I don't want to be like they have to rely on me. But you have to have people that are still champions. And we also have had this is a whole other thing, politics. Pataki was amazing as a governor as far as supporting this stuff. And I got to tell you, under Cuomo, it wasn't as good. And again, you know, I don't want to get into politics, but politics drives things too. And you don't realize it until you work in a government agency. So a lot of it is we don't have enough people at the table that understand the issues and the importance. We don't always have the right decision makers. They're not always involved. They're not involved early. Sometimes projects are happening and you needed them there 2 years ago, not 6 months before the project because they've already designed it. And there's always a lot of this, where does it say I have to do that? I've seen that throughout my career. Where does it say I have to build a wildlife crossing? That's not my problem. And then again, the lacking of regulations. And I'm going to go quick on some of this because you're going to get the points. I don't have to hit on everything. But I think we all understand the fragmentation, and this is just a project I was involved with when I worked at DEC. Those are wetlands. But secondary development that comes behind changes the landscape. There's all kinds of things that are affected. That just shows the effects of wetlands. So these are things that I've come up with. I didn't get this out of a book or anything, but this is what I see. It's mortality, it's fragmentation, it's creating the barriers, it's degrading the habitat, and secondary land use that comes in with transportation. It's a great cartoon if you haven't ever seen that Bugs Bunny cartoon. NEPA, this is from the 60s. This is something that, again, it's not politically written correct. It should be saying people, whatever. But it talks about ecology and the importance of ecology. And one of the things at lunch was interested, that quote I hung up from Ella Leopold on my office wall, but I've never read any of Ella Leopold's books, honestly. Never have, but I always like quotes. I never wanted to, in my mind, get input from somebody, and I want to learn on my own. But NEPA says we're supposed to do this, but when you go to what we do in the U.S., it's like, what does the NEPA checklist say? Oh, threatened endangered species, no, wetlands, that's what you look at. You don't look at connectivity. But we have all the tools here to do it. And I've been talking to our federal highways. We need to rewrite some of the requirements. So again, we know things like the Florida, this is the California panther. I've been out and looked at that stuff. But I'm going to tell you, this is a story. Part of my last 15 years was working at DOT. I covered the Adirondacks and Catskill Park, working with 5 regions. You want to talk about hardening your skin. Every region's got different mindsets and personalities and people that think you're coming in. And, I believe in a couple things. I'm there to make sure the public is served, and these environmental resources are important, and also the transportation system. And there's a cost to doing business, and we have to be able to weigh both of that. But this culvert that was put in up on Route 3 was a barrier since 1960. It just finally got fixed, but this is a barrier since really, it's actually before I was born. And it's like, that's 12 miles of trout habitat that's been blocked because of an engineering decision. It should have been a bridge, not 2 corrugated culvert pipes. We know this is everywhere, and I've talked to a lot of people, and the people do care. And this picture here is a person with a snapping turtle, gopher tortoise. These 2 ladies on the left, I thought they were going to get hit by a car. They were champions. They grabbed that snapping turtle, took it off the road. 2 weeks ago, when we were trying to figure out it was a Florida soft shell or something. But anyhow, there's one in the road down in Venice, and I jumped out of the car and I grabbed this thing because immediately pulled over. I see it, and people were trying to, they were trying to get it, but they were afraid of it. I didn't know. I grabbed it. It's like trying to get me, but I get it off. And this car pulls up, and this woman says to me, "You're so brave." So I got back in my car, and my wife put me right back where I belonged, and she's, "Let's get to the beach. You're not that brave." But anyhow. But again, people care, but you don't hear from these people. At DOT, 25 plus years, how often did I hear? I heard about things like road salt from a lot of the Adirondack groups, but I didn't hear about how many bridges did you fix right. We know there's a cost. There's not a lot of experts on this either. This is just some information. The other thing we have to understand, project type, the cost. There's so many things associated with projects, you gotta know where the opportunities are. And a lot of people in this room don't know that. And they gotta know how to kind of work with whether it be the Ministry of Transportation in Quebec, or if it be in Ontario, or if it be in New York State DOT. You need people that can get in there. And so there's so many things that you have to look on both sides.
So Ed, why don't you go 5 more minutes, and then we'll take 5 minutes to get coffee, and then you'll be right back up here with some other panelists.
Right.
You can
Yep. So this is just a project I did on my own, but I saved the client $100,000 because I didn't have, but essentially we have a wildlife management area, we have the Seneca River on one side, got them to build a green space in the development. Town loved it. It was, the other thing I was going to say is one of the things I'm now qualified for, though I don't know if I will be, because now with Carvana, I'm a used car salesman. I have learned that throughout my career. I know how to sell cars. I always have to sell. And, and frankly, that's what you have to do. You have to sell to people what it is that they can get and what it costs. It comes down to money. It comes down to time. Can you fit the schedule? And That picture before was just that was my son back in 2004. He's doing Blanding's turtle work with his brother right now in the Hudson Valley. But there's hot spots. These are priority action locations. We did these on Judd Road in 1997. And one of the things, science sometimes trips us up. People are like, oh, they won't work if they don't have light. You can't put that on an interstate. You hit that with a snowplow, you will wreck the truck. We did them without those and said, heck with it. But it costs $5,000 on a 4-lane highway to put those in when you're building the road. If you want to do it today, it's $150,000 for each one of those. We monitored them for 3 years. We just got thousands of pictures of 7 different species of wildlife. The only thing that wouldn't use them was coyotes. They're small, and there's a lot of reasons why they're small, but it was because of the road elevation that we had to go with. We have so many tools now. This is something that, on Route 3, we were doing some density modeling, looking at flow patterns and where we could look at things, but you got to also drive the road. These are great, but you got to go out and look at things. And this is something Michelle Herman from the Wetland Trust, I've talked to her a lot. This is something really important, but this is an old bridge, but look what uses it, fish, raccoon. I'm doing some work with some people down in the Florida Panther. I hope I'll get to those slides. But this is the one thing I want to talk about. This is the most important thing. I think Caitlin, she just talked about this, but Minnesota, I brought them to DOT, they do this. This is what we need to do at every bridge. Every bridge in Ontario, every bridge in New York, every bridge in Vermont has to look at this. Can we do this? We don't need shot rock that ungulates will not walk through. That's just simple fencing in Tupper Lake that keeps the turtles off. It's been highly effective. This is a graphic we did in our travel corridor planning, using this to kind of explain to the engineers. It has a daytime use to it. If you can cover the rock, people don't trip putting their kayak in. It's also good for wildlife. This is the Minnesota. We did a training with 200 engineers. I'm still waiting for DOT to put this out in our design meeting. Minnesota said, we'll give you all the design stuff. You don't have to do all the work. You can fix it or modify it, whatever you want, but we'll give it to you. They came and presented on an electronic presentation. One of my follow-ups is checking in on where that is, because I started that 5 years ago and the guidance is still not written. I say this often, we're not bringing the Apollo 13 back to Earth here, folks. Putting that type of a detail under a bridge is simple. And that's what a lot of times happens, is people overthink things. John, we're almost out?
Yeah, why don't you give us a 2-minute summary, and then let's take a 5-minute
All right,
break.
let me just see, I'm just gonna go through quick. There's that culvert. We did some stuff with NAC. One thing I just want to mention, and people have heard of NAC, we started this in the park. There's no velocity meters with NAC. Well, the engineers start running calculations, DEC, our fisheries people say, oh, that's too fast, you can't, you got to do something different. Well, that's after a 50-year storm. We started running velocity meters showing that 99% of the time the streams are passable. Let's not get tripped up on the design because of a 50-year storm. You got to remember cost. Building in a grass wall, we had to do a 4-mile detour on this, but that cost $1 million to build a grass wall to stage construction. The only reason why that culvert got replaced is because it was separated. There was the one picture you've seen before that. But then the engineers were, how are we going to put gravel in there? It's like, this is how. And, I've learned these things from different people in different states, and that's the other thing. It's so important, is understanding what goes on. This is some of the stuff out west. I'm just going to hit a couple. That's a salt hotspot out in Utah. It's out near where I hunt. That's an elk. They got hit right near it. These are things that could be on their mapping that people are talking about, but that should be addressed. There's ways to fix that. This is the Florida Panther thing I was looking at recently. One of the biggest problems, you have these canalways next to it. A Florida Panther will swim, but they sure as heck would prefer something over that thing. And they're trying to make new things, but it's like, put the darn logs across that canalway or give them something to go across. It's so simple. This is some stuff in Colorado I just looked at last year. $18 million project. This is a Jackson Hole. Shot rock, yes, but they, done for the boats, but ungulates can get around that. This is Wyoming, amazing feature. And, just, again, I love it. If you build it right, they will use it. And why is Wyoming doing it? This stuff is important to their economy. I go back to what I said in the beginning. We're not doing this always because, it's the right thing, but people start seeing the right way. In Florida, a Republican governor supports this. Now, again, I'm not trying to bring politics into it, but let's not assume that everything has to be political, but this is really good stuff that Florida is starting to do. Now, you go down there and see those highways, it's amazing. Somebody mentioned AI, this is the future in my mind. Driving a rental car right now, it slows me down when I come up on something. We need a thing that does infrared, recognizes wildlife. So there we go.
Thank you.
Final thoughts. Sorry that was a whirlwind, but you got a 2-hour training in 15 minutes.